philosophy is kind of unique among a lot of the subjects you could study in school because a lot of them are quite difficult to even just get into. Like you sit in a biology 101 class, and there can be times where you're just like, whoa, this is too much. Like I don't understand what you're even describing right now.
Mhm.
But philosophy has a really low floor, because people do philosophy all the time. They go to a bar and they have drinks and they get into weird conversations, or
Right.
they talk to their friends about important life issues, and or they just kind of think about sort of concepts that they deal with on a daily basis. And so like it's got a really low floor, but at the same time it has a really high ceiling, and it's very difficult to do it well. And that's what a lot of people don't realize about it. Like in popular culture, there's a lot of philosophy can get a lot of flack from people. They think it's just navel gazing and it's just kind of wishy washy thinking, and it's not really important. But the really good philosophers, the ones who've been published, are extraordinarily insightful and intelligent. And sometimes you read the things they say, and you're just like, how do people realize this sitting in a chair? Just thinking
Right.
stuff. It's pretty amazing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the important thing is, the difference between philosophy, I'll say like for fun, for lack of a better term, and philosophy that is actually impactful and important is just applying it to the right thing. Like we could talk about, what are the best survival tools to bring when you're on an abandoned island or uninhabited island. And, that's fun and sure, like it's a little wishy-washy and we're not really accomplishing much until the day comes that we actually are surviving on an island. But if you apply philosophy to psychology or politics or religion, anything like that, that's when, suddenly if you can if you can approach the topic in a philosophical manner that, you're actually doing something impactful. Would you agree with the statement that I made to you in the email that good philosophy, I forget exactly what I said, but something along the lines of good philosophy is essentially about being humble?
I think being a good, well, yeah, yeah. I would say that the best philosophers don't need to be, but everybody else does. In the sense that,
Hmm.
uh, the really good, and I'm talking like, top 10 or 20 philosophers of any given century. Uh, they have such an ability to cut right to the heart of a matter, of any matter. Like they can just pinpoint the issue of any situation and draw it out. I think they probably get impatient and frustrated talking to a lot of people, but that we're talking about the 1% of
Right.
the 1% of people who study philosophy. Everybody else, yeah, being humble is very important because there's so many different approaches to a philosophical problem, and there's even, in a sense, there's multiple answers. I don't want to say that all the answers are just as right, but all of them are. You can have a lot of answers that are close to being right, and it's very 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 few people who can distinguish like the merit of any of those. And so yeah,
Hmm.
that's where being humble comes in. Is that people can have views on things that are, for all intents and purposes, just as good as your view. Yeah.
And to me, and this is actually good. I was going to start in another subject, but this is a good segue into one of the things that we were going to talk about. Um, it's it's like for me, the idea of being humble in philosophy is to say that even when I feel absolutely certain that my thought is correct and my opinion is correct, like I might believe that, but I always have to be open to the fact that there's more things that I could learn out there, like more data that I could receive. And when I say data, I just mean like every this conversation, I'm receiving some amount of data from the things that you say, and everything I see in the world is data that I'm receiving that could theoretically show me why my opinion is incorrect. And just having that, like, that's where I use the word humility, to not be so certain that my own opinion is the right way, and be open to, maybe you might have something, I might have a strong opinion today, and you'll say something that makes me think about it in a completely different way and completely shakes that belief, and not having the egotistical attachment to my belief that, like, I can't be wrong because it would shatter me to realize that I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting when you're talking, when you're having a conversation and you're giving opinions back and forth. There's something that Marcus Aurelius says in the Meditations, a Stoic, and he says, he basically, to paraphrase it, he basically says, if you have an opinion and someone has something to say about it, either they're right or they're wrong. And so if they're right, you should listen to them and you should give them a chance to speak their mind, because if they're right, then you're going to learn something. It's going to correct an error in your own thinking. And if you're wrong,
Mm-hmm.
well, you had a chance to sort of defend your idea against somebody else's opinion. And so that's valuable for you to have gone through that process, to get a chance to learn somebody else's opinion on it, and then sort of go do the back and forth between yours and theirs. This is called a dialectical argument. You're not trying to win the argument. You're just trying to explore the truth through um, a game of logic, basically, of putting your idea up against their idea and kind of seeing, which one comes out on top. And yeah, and not in order to win, but in order to determine what exactly is the truth of this issue. And then that's what I love about philosophy. When it's practiced, I think I would say correctly, is when you're following that process, when you're just engaging in a search for the truth instead of trying to win an argument. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree completely, and that's actually you kind of touched on like the exact goal that I have for this podcast. Like one of the most essential, I guess, components that this was born out of is a disdain that I have for like the concept of debating. I think it's a good skill. It's good to be able to articulate your thoughts clearly. And so I have no issue with it on that front, but I think that debating comes down way more to like communication skills over who's actually right and wrong. Like I might hold a belief that is terribly wrong, and you might hold one that is completely true. But if I'm more articulate and more like aggressive at times, or like just in one way or another, I'm able to like intellectually run circles around you and make you look stupid. Everyone's gonna cheer for me and think that I won that debate. Meanwhile, I was wrong the whole time. And so I think, as you were saying, that it's important to, when you have like a debate style when I say debate, I just mean I have my opinion, you have yours, and maybe they're not the same. I should be approaching the conversation with the goal to learn first, and then speak my opinion second. And I should try to like fully understand why you think what you think and what it is that you really think before I'm trying to like prove you wrong. And maybe the answer is I'm not trying to prove you wrong, because maybe in the end we're kind of just saying the same thing. So yeah, that's kind of like, now my actually what but my real goal for this podcast, and I think I might have mentioned this to you a little bit, is I really want to be like hosting conversations between two people that know way more about a topic than I do and have opinions that they kind of disagree with each other. So right now what I'm doing is I'm talking to people like you, and really anybody who knows something about something, and is willing to come on and talk, so that I can kind of like build up that base of people that might be interested in coming back and speaking with someone else. So yeah, that's kind of what this is all about.
Yeah, I think you mentioned one thing in there that caught my attention when you were talking about debating, and you talked about how other people would cheer you on or something. To me, debating is specifically for an audience. Like to me,
Right.
that's the only interest I would have in it. Is if a politician needs to know how to debate, because they need to be able to have a discussion with one person and at the same time persuade a whole group of people. And so
Mm-hmm.
they're engaged in a debate with that person to win, not for their own, benefit so much, but because they're trying to persuade others. Um, in a situation where it's just two people back and forth, to me, debating is childish.
Yeah, I would agree.
And even in a case where it's like three or more people, I think that's still a great opportunity for a good discussion, because the synergy between three people or more talking about a single issue is actually can be almost intoxicating, because ideas are going back and forth, and people are jumping in and latching on to certain things, and they're building off an idea, and there's people disagree, and then there's just it's such a good back and forth. Yeah, definitely.
Right. Yeah. There was something. There was something else I was going to say before it slipped my mind, but we can get into. There was what I was saying before is we were kind of segueing nicely into a topic, so we can jump into that. And that's what you were saying. I believe the term was epistemology,
Oh,
which you described as basically like the philosophy of knowledge. And does knowledge actually exist? Can you actually know something? Um, and yeah, like I think that's kind of what we were talking about before. Is like, can you actually? Is there anything, any single thing in this world that we can actually be certain that we know? So I'll let you, kind of take that and run with it and give like your stance and what you've looked into on this.
sure. I mean, that's a huge question. It's a great topic, though. I love it. It's one of my favorite. And there's one of the things you mentioned is can we be certain that we know anything? And I think that right there is just a perfect example of how complex the question is, because you could just ask the follow up question: do we need to be certain about something before we can say we know it? I mean, can you have
Mm-hmm.
like a hunch? And can the hunch be like, let's say you just have a hunch about whether or not it's raining. You woke up, you haven't looked out the window, you can't tell how bright it is, and you just say, well, I think it might be raining. Maybe you don't even have a good reason for it. You just say, I think it might be raining. Then you go and you open the window and you see it's raining. Can you say you knew that? On the other hand, let's say you wake up in the morning and you think, I think it might be raining because it just seems really dark in here. I know it was cloudy last night, but I'm not sure if it is. But I think I have a good reason for it. The weather forecast even said it was going to rain. So then you go and you open the window and you see it's not raining. It's like, well, you had good reasons to think it was. Uh, it kind of leads to this idea in philosophy that's existed for about 2,700 years, going all the way back to about 700 BC with Socrates and Plato. And the idea is that knowledge actually consists in justified true belief. The idea is that
Right.
in order to know something, you have to actually, first off, you have to believe it, right? If I wake up in the morning and I just don't care whether or not it's raining, I have no belief whatsoever on it. Then you go and you open the window and it's raining. Well, you can't say that you believed it because you just didn't care. You didn't believe
Hmm.
the other. So belief is like sort of the first requirement for knowledge. But then the justification and the truth part are really interesting, because we think typically that in order to know something you have to have a good reason for it, right? If you just make a guess for a question on the test that you're taking in college for one of your classes, and then you turn it in and you turned out you got that question right, well, you wouldn't say, oh, I knew that. You'd know you just took a guess on it. You didn't know it. um, and then the third thing, of course, it has to be true. um, if you thought you knew the question and you studied really really hard and you guessed B and it turns out the question was A, well, obviously you didn't know the answer because it turned out to be A.
Hmm.
And you could kind of take this several different ways from that point. You can ask, well, okay, so do we have justified true belief about anything? And there's this idea in philosophy that's gone back a really long time, also to the ancient Greeks, called skepticism, which is basically the view that no, we can't. We cannot have justified true belief about anything, including whether or not we can have justified true belief about anything. They kind of leave that up in the open and say it's very, very possible that, yeah, we don't know anything at all. And then there's other ideas throughout the course of philosophy which have questioned this idea of justified true belief. So, yeah, it's definitely a very, very interesting topic.
So let me ask you, like, do you believe that there are things that we can say that we know? And I would even I'll pose another question, because as you're talking about this, like, there's one thing I'm like, well, let's just jump to this particular point. Like, I look outside and I see it's raining. Do I know it's raining?
Yeah,
Like, I
no,
feel like that's the line. Like, could we draw that and say, like, well, we know it's raining. I'm outside. It's wet. I'm getting wet. I see water. It's raining. I know that.
yeah, absolutely. And there's even other aspects to this. So let's give the picture perfect example. Let's say you wake up in the morning. You saw the weather forecast last night, and it said it was going to rain, and it seems kind of dark in the room, like it's cloudy, and maybe you even heard a little bit of rain already. So you're like, yeah, it's definitely raining. You open the window, sure enough, it's raining. So you have justified true belief. But here's another interesting question: could you say that you had knowledge that it was raining before you actually checked? Do you need verification of this belief to actually call this knowledge, or can you just say, in bed, yeah, it's raining. Yes, I know it's raining, even though you haven't checked yet. That's another question about knowledge is the verification aspect.
Right. Yeah. But so wait. But so would you say though that if I can look and see that it is raining, then I can say that I know that it's raining, and therefore there are some things that we can know for certain.
Okay, so that's the question. That is the fundamental question. I think so. So okay, so there's different kind of ways you can answer this too. Like all philosophy, it's kind of contextual, and you got to look at
Mm-hmm.
it from different angles. Um, there's the everyday definition of knowing something. So justification. Let me put it this way: justification can happen in degrees or
Mm-hmm.
levels, right? You can be kind of justified. You can be extremely justified or extremely certain. Or let me rephrase. You could have really, really, really good, concrete, irrefutable reasons to believe something, or just kind of pretty good reasons. In the everyday world of life, whether or not it's raining, questions like that. Yeah, I think you can know things. Absolutely. Um, can you know things to the standard that, like, really, really hardcore philosophy requires you to know things? It's tricky. I'd say probably not. If there's some classic works in philosophy, like Descartes' Meditations, which kind of go through this process of how you can doubt things. And really ingenious philosophers can come up with really, really um, compelling reasons why you can actually doubt things if you really think about it. There's the fact that your senses are not always reliable, right? So
Mm-hmm.
your senses can deceive you sometimes. If that's true, how do you know exactly when they're deceiving you and when they're not? If you knew that, they would never deceive you. So that's a tough question. There's also the fact that sometimes you can be dreaming, and in your dream you can feel 100% certain that this is real, and then of course you wake up and all of a sudden you're like, oh yeah, it's just a dream. And so in philosophy, when you're sitting in like a class and these arguments come across you, it can be almost kind of uh, bewildering because you're like, wait a minute. Now, throughout the course of my day, there are certain things I know, and these certain things always end up coming true. And you can, uh, you know how to get to work each morning when you drive your car. You know the route because you always make it. Doubting this just seems kind of absurd. So on a day to day basis, on a real life basis, yeah, you can know things. But when you get down to it, you really when you ask yourself, when you have a very strong standard of justification that you're trying to meet, like in a philosophy class, I'd say no. You can never be 100% justified with something. This idea of proof that is very common. People say, "Well, prove it." The field that proof is the most easy to come by would be something like math, right? So the idea of something like 1 + 1 = 2. And people will say, well, surely you could know that 1 + 1 = 2. Um, and why is that? Well, because you could prove it. I mean, you could prove it both in your day to day life. You can always take one apple and another apple and put them together and you get two apples. But that always applies. And then also at the same time, you can just think about it and you can be like, well, it's obviously true. I mean, it would seem to defy logic to not be true. The interesting thing about that is that there is a sort of a faith that you take logic on. that whenever you think something's true because it's logical, can you actually explain why things that are logical are always true? You can't. It's sort of like gets you in a
Mm.
circular loop, because in order to explain why things that are logical are always true, you'd have to resort to logic to prove that, right? So you actually get to a point where there are certain things that you can't know. You kind of take on a sort of faith, and that to even try to prove them gets yourself caught in this loop. And it's yeah, that's when your head kind of explodes, and you're like, all right, time to move on and do something else now.
Yeah, I think it comes back to this, to the point of like data and the things that we know. Like, let's just say 1 + 1 = 2. We know that to be absolutely true, and the reason we know that to be true is because we've never encountered an exception to that rule. In all of the times where one has been added to one, in the experience, I mean, to my knowledge, in the experience of every single human being, the result has always been two. Now, you could apply that to a broader a broader spectrum, not necessarily just this particular equation of 1 + 1 = 2, but is it possible, philosophically, is it possible that we could at some point encounter a situation where 1 + 1 does not equal 2? And for whatever reason, like I can't think of a single reason why or how that could possibly happen, but is it possible that we could encounter that? And I guess, like, theoretically, again, like, I'm not going to be here on camera saying that maybe 1 + 1 doesn't equal 2. Like, but when it comes to anything that we could say that obviously we know that for certain, is there any chance, statistically speaking, that something could happen that interrupts that? And the thing is, if you can acknowledge that, okay, yes, like maybe there's one thing out there that I think seems absolutely certain, but I could understand, I could fathom a way that maybe that rule could be broken. Now suddenly you have to apply that to, you don't know which of those things that could apply to. Like, it could be anything, basically. So I think also you got to look at it as, like, when we're talking about the word, like, do we know something? Like, philosophically, maybe we could say, no, you can't know anything. But, like, functionally, can we operate as though we absolutely know something? And I think there, like, I mean, of course, the answer is yes. If I think I know how to get to work every single day, take the same route every time, and I always get to work just the same, like, then functionally you can operate as though you know exactly for sure how to get to work every day. So I think, like, moving the goalpost there a little bit makes this a much, like, simpler topic.
Yeah, a couple things you said there are really interesting. The first thing that caught my attention, one of my favorite quotes of all time, is by a philosopher named Dan Dennett, and he says, "Let's not mistake a lack of imagination for an insight into reality." And
Mm,
what that means is this idea
I
that,
like that.
yeah, it's really cool. This idea that I can't imagine how that could be false. Doesn't by itself prove that it can't be false. It just means that it's very difficult to understand how it could be. You know, Euclidean geometry was something that people couldn't even imagine how it could be false until Einstein came along and showed. And I think it was actually maybe even before Einstein. But so I'm not a physics guy, but sometimes I'll bring physics stuff into for examples. But another thing that was interesting that you said is the idea that every time in the past that we've added 1 + 1 and we got 2. So there's two types of sort of ways we come to know things. Well, there's more than two, but the two major types throughout history are called deduction and induction. And
Okay.
the difference between them, deduction is definitely the much more certain form of knowledge, and deduction is when you say something like the standard example in philosophy, the argument that's always used to explain this is all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. So if all, and you could even, you know, give, give the modern day version of, if all people are mortal, right, and Socrates is a person, then Socrates has to be mortal. Those two things together mean that Socrates has to be mortal. So that's deduction. Induction would be something more like, uh, every I'm trying to think of a new example. The standard example for induction is something like every swan that you see is white. Let's say you do a survey and you travel all over the world to every continent, and you in each continent you do a survey of like 1,000 swans, and you go all over the continent from west to east, north, south, central, and you look at every single swan that you could find, and let's say every single one of them is white fur. So then you get this. You can actually come up with this principle or this general rule that says it looks like all swans are white. Um, so that's induction, because and what that means is that you're using the past results to come up with a rule to describe future results. Um, Induction is very, very popular in the sciences, and in fact, most of the fields like sciences or social sciences that you'd study in college are going to primarily use induction. Deduction would be a lot more popular in like philosophy courses and mathematics courses, logic courses, maybe some engineering courses. But the interesting thing about the difference between those two is that deduction is fairly certain. You've got a premise: all people are mortal. You've got a second premise: Socrates is a person, so that you have a conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That conclusion must follow. It must follow all the time. But in induction, it's generally more of like a percentage of probability. Um, the 10,000 swans I surveyed all have white fur. Therefore, it's a 99 point, I don't know, 6% chance that the next swan I survey is going to have white fur. But you can even extrapolate from that as well to math. You can say, well, every single person who's ever lived, who's done the calculation 1 plus 1, if they've done it correctly, they've gotten 2, right? So 1 plus 1 equals.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the certainty of this is more than 99.6%. It's like 9.999 repeating like 1,000 times. But I mean, that's not. I mean, if you explain mathematics via induction, that's not the certain knowledge you're looking for. But the other interesting thing about mathematics is that 1 plus 1 equals 2 can actually be broken down to a deductive argument, and you could show that 2 is a conclusion that follows. Now, I don't know how to do that. I just know this is possible. I know there was a book written in the early 20th century. It was a book written by two philosophers, Bertrand Russell and Alfred Whitehead, called Principia Mathematica, and it was a 2 volume, 1,500 page just beast of a book, and it took them like 1,500 pages, somewhere around a lot of pages, to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2 deductively. But yeah, it's pretty interesting.
So, I mean, this is really just to be annoying right now, but like, wouldn't you say that even the deductive example that you gave could be inductive? Because I could say like it would make sense to say that every single person is mortal, but we say that because every single person that we have ever encountered seems to have been mortal.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that premise is essentially proved via an inductive argument. So, in a sense, the deductive argument relies on an inductive argument. Yeah, these types of reasoning, they go back and forth. And I mean, on an average day, a person uses both types of reasoning all the time. And
Mm-hmm.
it's actually one of the most foremost examples in history of literature is Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes has this reputation as being, the king of deduction. He solves all of his mysteries via deduction. But in fact, that's not entirely true. What he does is he goes, if you ever read a Sherlock Holmes novel, he'll go throughout the novel and he'll pick up on certain clues here and there in certain places. He's investigating the crime. He walks into the building and he sees that there's a dog, right? And he concludes the perpetrator must have known the dog knew the perpetrator. They knew each other. Why? Because the dog didn't bark. And usually dogs don't bark when they see somebody they know, right? That's an inductive argument. What'll happen then is he'll take all of these inductive arguments and clues and inductive thinking that he does throughout the novel. And then at the very end of the novel, he does his grand reveal where he combines them all into a deductive argument and proves who done it, who the criminal was. And so, yeah, I mean, these types of thinking, they happen every day. When you're driving to work and you see that there's a lane, or you see that there's a route that's closed, you can't turn right here. You have to use a quick deductive argument on the fly. I mean, it's a really simple one, but you say to yourself, I'm going to have to go a different route. Why? Because I can't get that way. I can't go that route. That's if I need to get to work, then if I need to get to work and this route is closed, I must follow another route. That's your conclusion. I have to go. So that's a deductive argument. Then induction comes into play, and you say, okay, how do I get to work? I can't turn right here. Then you say, okay, I remember a couple months ago when I took this other route, and I'm sure it's still a valid route. I'm assuming they haven't closed the roads or whatever in that route. So then you go that way. Well, that was an inductive argument that you used to actually get yourself there. But you're just in the span of 10 seconds, you used an inductive argument and a deductive argument. And so, yeah,
Right.
they happen. They go back and forth all the time.
Gotcha. I'm sorry. I'm gonna pause for 1 second. I just have to. I gotta plug in my charger, and it means I have to switch up my wiring for a sec. Okay. So I would like to get into another topic. So I think I want to present the other topic, but then I want to ask you a slightly different question before we get into it. So the next thing I want to talk about is, which political system do we feel is best? The first question I want to ask you, though, before we get into that is, when you're having discussions like this, do you think that it's important to have, like, I'm going to say like a leading belief? Like, even though I might be approaching this with with the humble perspective of, I know nothing really about politics. I'm not a world leader. Like, I'm not in that position. And so I really, even the little bit of stuff that I've seen in the world, I don't really have any right to have a real opinion on this. And I can, I think that that's true. However, based on what I have seen in the world, I'm going to say that this is what I think is best. And I'm open to that being wrong, but I'm not just going to say, we can look at this in a million different ways, and I'm not really going to take any stance. Do you think it's important I won't say in every single case, but in a lot of times, to try to have, here's what I'm tending to think is probably the right way to go?
That's such a good question. And I'll be perfectly honest, I've actually only very briefly have ever thought about that in my life. But I don't think it is. No, I don't think it's important at all, to tell you the truth. There's a lot of things in my mind that I'm kind of undecided about, but I still am interested in talking to people about them. In some sense, I think, not having a preconceived opinion about something, or a preconceived stance about something before you go into a conversation, makes for a better conversation, because you're not trying to present your idea, right? You're just exploring all the options. And I know that, and just to kind of come clean a little bit. So I knew that this was going to be one of the questions that came up. And so I have done some reading about this, and I have been kind of thinking about how I want to answer this. And the question that you just asked makes me now think, I shouldn't have done that. I should have been more open-minded about this and just kind of come into it and been let's see what happens,
Well, I would like to say that, and this is something that I have thought a lot about, and in the same way, like what we were talking about before, this is another leading principle that I had, for why I wanted to do this podcast, in general, not just this one specifically, and it's the idea that we need to be able to recognize that two things can be true at the same time. I think, and especially in this age of an insane amount of information at your fingertips, just for the perfect example, take any hotly debated topic in politics. You can go and look up and say why XYZ is good and why XYZ is bad, and find perfectly logical, fact-based, well thought out reasons to support both sides. To the point where, if you were to take somebody from even, let's just say, 100 years ago, and put them in here today and give them one article from either side, by the end of that, I'm quite certain that by the end of that, no matter what they believed before, like they're probably going to read that article and say, how could I not agree with this? Like this one sounds right. And so like that has me thinking on the more like broader sense that like we never really have the complete picture of truth. And I think like we try to simplify what truth means because it's easier to see things as like this is right or this is wrong, and not looking at like the complexity of what actual truth could look like. And so like in this case, I would say that both of those things can be true at one time. I can say that I'm not coming into this conversation with any preconceived notions because I really don't know the answer. However, at the same time, with a gun to my head, if you said like, which do you think is right? Like, what are you leaning towards? I do have an answer. Like, I have my best guess. And I think I don't see anything, as long as there is the caveat mentioned that like, I'm not an expert. I'm not going to like, I would definitely not want to bet everything that I have on this answer, but this is what seems to be the case for me. And you don't always have to have that, but I think I definitely don't see any problem with expressing that if you are leaning in one way in particular.
Yeah, and I think that was an interesting thing you brought up about the political issues, and you can read a political issue and you can come out on one side or the other, because you asked the question, what's like the best political system or best style of government? Or you can ask the question, what's the best policy stance or position you should take on this policy?
Hmm.
And you're asking something about two different things. You're on one hand, you're talking about the whole entire government. On the other hand, you're talking about a specific policy. But on the other hand, you're asking for the same you're asking about the same thing, and in the sense that you're asking about what's the best, right? What's the best policy? What's the best government? And that's where I think so much political disagreement comes from, and people don't always realize how entrenched that disagreement is because of that fact. And really where that comes from is that it's at the root, it's a difference in value. It's a disagreement in values.
Hmm.
Um, and the thing you mentioned about how you take somebody 100 years ago or 500 years ago, you bring them to today and you have them read um, two position articles, two stances, and they are evaluating which one. It's going to be interesting because the situation, the circumstances are going to be totally different, but they're going to bring their same values that they had, from 500 years ago to today, and they're going to evaluate both of those positions on their own personal values, and they're going to come out and say, well, the first one's better or the second one's better, and they're both probably good policies in the sense that they're going to accomplish what the policy writers wanted from them. They
Exactly.
have certain values too, and they're saying, um, how do we create our values in society? Well, we got to do this or we got to do that, and so that's the interesting thing is that um, policy can be good, well constructed, well created policy, or a government can be a very well constructed, well created government, but somebody's going to think it's a terrible solution because it's so, anathema to their own value system. And that's
Hmm.
the interesting thing. Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of emotion that's tied to it too. Like, for example, a lot of people in the United States hear the word communism and like don't even really know what that means, and they immediately get fired up. Like communism, absolutely not. Like, it's terrible. It's a terrible thing. And not to say whether or not they're right or wrong, but I think most people who have that like visceral reaction to it, like they don't really know what they're talking about. Um, so yeah, so that being said, like, do you have any leading theories on or thoughts here of
Yeah. I would,
what's viable and what's not?
yeah, definitely. Well, I would say definitely. Here you go. But I mean, like, so I mentioned how I have been thinking about this.
Sure.
This idea of like best is really kind of, I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And I think it would help to kind of clarify. And this is where we can kind of get into the specifics of the question. What do we
Mm-hmm.
mean by the best government? What
Mm-hmm.
is, what are our values that we want to see instantiated in a government.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, did you have any ideas on like what you think, like what best means in this case?
Okay, so ideas on what best means. Um, hmm. It's not. I have not given that any thought, but I would say. I mean, I'm gonna start with the very simple statement of like the well-being of people, and this could very quickly get into the topic that we had on the call the other night or a couple weeks ago about is it in I'm probably going to butcher the point here kind of like is it in a government's responsibility to act in favor of those that are outside of that government's country, because if I say like
Sure.
if I say that the best outcome is positive welfare of the people, well, what people exactly are we talking about? I would say, for the sake of this conversation, let's say for the people of that country, because I would say that I certainly wouldn't say that a country or a government has no obligation to the welfare of people outside of it, but I would say that first and foremost, its obligation is to the people of that country because of the system of countries that we have. So yeah, so let's say, and I mean, I guess welfare of the people, standard of living. I guess that's a really tough question because different people are going to have different opinions of what a good life is, and what as far as like how their government can provide that. Yeah, I don't know. Is there anything that you would say that should be included in the best outcome?
I would say that's a great start. I mean, in a lot of ways, that to me, I would agree with that 100%. I would say that, and I would kind of what I would do is extrapolate, or I guess maybe broaden that from like well-being of people and quality of life and living conditions to actually encompass just morality as a whole, and to just say that, like, to me the best government is one that through its policies and its laws and its all of the functions of a government creates a moral situation or a moral reality for people to live in the sense
Hmm.
that, um, I mean, this is always the example when you're talking about, well, what's a bad government look like. So you talk about the Nazis, right? A government that its primary function is to start a world war and commit genocide. That's not a good set of moral living conditions or a moral reality for people to live in. And so I would say that's a great example of a bad government. Um, but then you can kind of get into some specifics here, and you can say, okay, so what if we took a government that was a totalitarian dictatorship like the Nazis, except instead of doing bad things with their power, they did really good things. Let's say they created a tremendously healthy and flourishing living condition for all their citizens, um, and they were peaceful with their neighbors and they engaged in excellent cooperation. Would that be a good government? And then that's where you start getting into some interesting sort of specifics about it, I think.
Yeah, it's so I'm thinking that we could kind of like skip over what could be a lot of discussion around this with the very simple statement of a good government is comprised of good people, and all of the I'm sure we could come up with some bad government systems, but all of the kind of well-known, tried and tested systems of governing could probably all be viable as long as you have the right people managing them. So like I've actually said I've recorded some podcast episodes that I never aired, where I've had actually this exact conversation, and I've said like almost a little bit jokingly, but like not really, that I think that the best government out there is an absolute monarchy. As long as you have the right, if you could find the singular person in the world, or at least in the country, who is by whatever criteria you want to rate fit to rule, you know, honest and loving and kind and courageous and like all the good qualities we'd want to see in a leader, and you could give that person absolute power, I mean, I think we'd have a beautiful country in a very short amount of time. The problem with democracy is things are so slow. Everything takes time. Like, you got to go through all these battles with Congress, and however that all works. Like, someone might say, "Here's a great idea. It sounds really reasonable. Everyone can agree with this," but it might then take years for that to ever actually get implemented, if at all. There's some people that oppose it, maybe even for selfish reasons. And so I think if you can get the right man for the job, a monarchy is the way to go. Obviously, well, I'll stop there and I'll let you comment on that.
That's really interesting, because at first when you said that, I had this reaction of, oh no, monarchy would be terrible. It's got to be democracy. But the more you kind of explained it, the more I started thinking about it. I actually do agree with you in a way. So it's kind of interesting. I think at this point it would be helpful to clarify exactly what the role of government is. What's the point of having a government? Why do we need one? And generally, I mean, it's you want to have some control over a population to enable social stability. Because ultimately, and again, we go back to this idea that a good government is one that creates a moral reality for people to live in. A world where people are just running amok, killing each other, stealing from each other. There's no social stability there. That's not a moral world to live in. You want a world where there's laws and that there's somebody to enforce the law. So in other words, you want a world where there's an authority that can command people to do things, and at the same time coerce them into doing these things, or in other words, like punish them if they break the law or something.
Mm-hmm.
So then at that point you say, okay, so you've got, let's say, two different types of government. You got a monarchy on one hand, and you got a democracy on the other. And there's different kinds of democracies too. We could talk a little bit about like the ancient Greeks had a direct democracy, which means that every single person voted on every single issue that came across. It wasn't just, like we have, where we have a representative democracy and we vote somebody into office and then that person votes on every single issue that comes across. So let's forget about that for now. Let's take the democracy and the monarchy. Um, Regardless of which one, the democracy or the monarchy, you want a government that's going to create a moral reality for people to live in. So that means they need to have moral laws. They need to have laws that are fair, they're just, they're impartial. They don't protect special interests. They treat everybody the same. And and in that case, what you'd have is, regardless of whether you had the democracy or the monarchy, the people are gonna, or they should want to follow the laws because the laws themselves are just. Following, if everybody follows the law, we have a good, just, stable society. And so that's where, when you were talking, I started thinking, well, in that sense, actually, yeah, you do get a good situation in both cases, because you have, let's say you had just laws in both cases, then the people should want to follow the laws and everything works out. I think the only problem I would have with that is the one sort of um, elephant in the room, right? And this is the question of being of a people who have a stake in their own laws, who have a say in the laws that should follow. Um, yeah, and that's a very complicated issue. And so, what do you think about that so far?
Well, I mean, I certainly, just to like blow everything that I said to bits, like the reason why it doesn't actually work is because, let's say you could somehow find the way to pick the perfect guy for the job, or girl, guy or girl for the job. What happens when they die? Now, who replace, like, it is not realistic to think, like, eventually you're going to get one bad actor, and the speed at which the good ruler was able to make the world a beautiful place, you get one person who, is greedy or incompetent or for whatever reason isn't fit for the job, and just as quickly as it all turned good, it could all go bad. So ultimately, that's why, like, I create this hypothetical situation why this would work super well, but realistically, it's probably not the best way to go. Um, yeah, I mean, I think the important thing is to like really understand human nature when looking at this. Like, for example, you said something along the lines of that if you can have fair and just rules, that people would want to follow them, right? Like, which makes perfect sense. They should. For people who, I'd like to think of myself as like an ethical person who tries to do the right thing and wants the right thing to happen. That sounds great, but the reality is we have plenty of fair and ethical. I won't say that all rules we have are fair and ethical, but for the most part, we have lots of rules that are fair and ethical, and people break them. And so, like, I think that figuring out, and it's it's the same issue with what I said about how the monarchy isn't going to work, because eventually you're going to get like just by by statistics, eventually somebody is going to find themselves in that seat that isn't the right person for the job. And so I think it's important to understand what we are prone to as humans when we're looking at like what a good government system would look like. And so that's where like you can make the case for democracy, that essentially if you can muddy the waters and add more and more people into it, then that seems like at least on paper, viable way to mitigate that risk, because now we're diluting the greed and all the other bad things that could be in a government.
Yeah, I would agree with that. As you were talking about, you get somebody in office, somebody in the throne who's just a terrible leader. It just occurred to me that, yeah, and then you get the Game of Thrones situation, basically.
Exactly. And Game of Thrones is a perfect example. Like
Yeah,
if Jon Snow had ended up on the throne, like things could have been pretty good.
yeah.
But
You,
instead, you get all the Joffreys and all these other people that are incompetent
right.
for
Well,
one
and then
or another.
you also get a situation where uh, instead of it being a clear criteria for being in charge, like winning an election, it becomes in the case of someone's death or whatever, it becomes a really sort of muddy situation of, well, who's next in line,
Hmm.
and you can, and that's where you get a lot of schism, I think. I think that's another good point. Talking about what is a good, what's the best government. I think that's another factor, is that the best government is one that's not only has a clear set of laws for the people, but has a clear set of laws and rules for its own operation. One that's well designed in the sense that it's always perfectly clear who is in charge,
Mm.
who are the leaders, or in the case of, like, if it's like a direct democracy, then it's always a case with it. Well, we vote on everything. There's nobody in charge. We all have our own individual percentage or whatever of being in charge. And I think that's something I was actually just thinking about, is the United States, I believe, is the world's oldest democracy.
Hmm.
And I think it's really interesting, actually, how we have this document that's like 250 years old now. That anytime there's any kind of disagreement, that we go back to and we ask, is it constitutional? You know,
Yeah.
and it's interesting how, like, it gets amended. We add these amendments to it. We say we're going to make this a new part of it. But once and actually we can go back. It's a living document. We can go back and we can change other amendments. We can take them off the books. We can put them on. But it requires enormous. Let's say that right. It requires a lot of agreement, a
Right.
considerable amount of agreement of everybody. In fact, you can maybe even, I think you could be skeptical that it might be a long time before we ever get that level of agreement again to add an amendment. But then you look at governments that have been like overthrown, revolutions happen. They draw up a new constitution, and I think that's really bad for a government, because people don't have the same level of respect for a constitution that's 10 years old as they do for
Hmm.
that's 250 years old.
True.
And there's a stability that comes with that that I think that's part of that's an outcome of the fact that it was such a well-designed system from the very beginning. Clear rules on who's in charge, how they get there. You can literally trace the chain of command from the president all the way down to like the fourth ranked person in the Senate on who would be the next in line if someone were to pass or something. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, it is interesting how that's like planned for, and it is it's something that I've thought about. Like, I don't question it as in like I don't challenge it because I don't, again, like I don't know any better. But it is interesting to me how we look at the Constitution as like, equivalent to like the Bible as a Christian would view it. In if it's in like, the founding fathers knew best. If it's in the Constitution, then it's right and we should listen to it. And like there's really, I feel like on both sides of the political spectrum, you don't really hear anyone saying like, like, I don't know about the Constitution. Like maybe we should rethink some of these things. Like everyone pretty much agrees you have to follow the Constitution. And I mean, probably on the same, for the same reason why we do respect the Constitution because it is so old, there has to come a time where you got to start asking, is it too old? Is it outdated? Like, what happens if I would have to say I doubt that this is likely, but let's say in 10,000 years the United States is still around. Are we still just rocking with the same old Constitution? Nothing's changed. Like, maybe there's been a couple amendments, but it's the same thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's where the amendment process comes in, and where because we can, I think, although, and I don't didn't really study a lot of political science, but I think
Mhm.
the first 10 amendments are that's the Bill of Rights, something,
That I believe that's correct.
and I think those are unchangeable, or I don't know, but what I think that's an interesting idea, this concept of that you said, is that we go, any disagreement, whether it's between Democrats, Republicans, whoever, the
Mhm.
sort of the adjudicator of this is, well, let's take it back to the Constitution and look and see what that says, and that decides the issue, and I think that's really interesting because we do have what we think is a democracy. It's a representative democracy, so we value the idea of the democratic process. And I think that's an interesting point that we don't say always, like the deciding factor isn't, well, let's put it to a vote. That's one of them. That's like the first thing we try, right? But ultimately, most people agree that the Constitution overrides a vote. If people were to vote that speech criticizing the government should become illegal, I think people would say, no, that's unconstitutional. You can't do that.
Mhm.
I think that's really interesting because what it is it's kind of like a check on democracy that says, look, there are some ideals which are so important and so crucial to a moral state of affairs that we're not going to allow ourselves to screw that up. Even if everybody were to come out, even if like 80% of the people were to come out and say, we're going to outlaw this religion, I mean, the Constitution would say, nope, you can't do that. The freedom of religion is too important of a freedom to allow democracy to decide that. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and I mean I would certainly argue that absolutely for the better. You know, I am absolutely a believer that just because something is popular does not make it true, does not make it right. And I think most people would say they agree with me, but I don't know how many actually do in practice. And even myself, I mean, if enough people tell me that the sky is green, like I'm gonna start looking up and being like, "Am I the only idiot that thinks it's blue?" I'll start doubting myself. I think it's normal to think that to a certain extent. But what that made me think of is, and we're talking about that it comes down to like a successful government is all about the people. Do you have the right person for the job or not? And the system doesn't really matter too much beyond that. It's pretty. What exactly am I trying to say here? Like, for the timeline that we're on right now, meaning like, how we got to this point in the world, and all the different things that could have had the world looking very different. For us to get to the point that we're at right now, it's extremely, I'll say lucky, coincidental, if you believe in that seemingly the people who founded America were those good. And a lot of people will have things to say about, like, like a lot of them owned slaves and stuff like that maybe they weren't the best people. But at least from a political standpoint, we all pretty much agree that the Constitution is correct and good and right. Like, they could just, it doesn't take a good, competent political leader to win a war. Like, we could have won our independence, and not to mention, I mean, if I'm correct here in my history, that it was largely because France stepped in and helped us that we actually won the war. But we could have just as easily had greedy, corrupt, incompetent people who were leading the charge when we won the war, and they could have, which I guess actually, I mean, we had the oh God, what was before the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation. So we did actually have that in the first place. So that's actually kind of flipping what I'm saying on its head. I don't remember actually how the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, which is interesting. How, like, we actually were successfully able to make that switch, whereas now, like, no one's going to come up with a new document instead of the Constitution and say, this is actually the better one, we should change. But at one point or another, the right people made this roadmap for how our government is going to work, and we're following it today. Like, it could have just as easily been written maybe in more subtle ways to be negative and to, help out a lot of people and hurt others. So it's interesting how that it very easily could have gone a different way, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah. It could have been, like you said, written in more subtle ways. It could have just been written poorly, and
Right.
it wasn't. It's so, I mean, Thomas Jefferson. One of the other quotes that I love is, I think it's from John Kennedy, and he had a gathering of Nobel Prize winners in the White House, and he invited them for dinner. And he said, "This is the most amazing collection of intellects in the White House that we've ever seen, except for when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." I love that.
That
Um,
is good.
yeah. And I like something you said towards the beginning of that. You said something about a good government is one that makes sure the right people are in the job, like good and just people. And I think that's where a weakness of democracy comes into play, because oftentimes the person who gets elected is not necessarily the person who's the best ruler, but is just merely the person who's the best at running a campaign and getting elected.
Totally. 100%.
I think that happens especially when there's no incumbent running, because there's no track record, there's no resume to look at and see, well, how well did this person do, in the last term. And then I also think something interesting about the Constitution, and this is sort of another criteria of what makes for a good government, is that, and not just a good government, but a good nation in general, is that a good nation is capable of reflecting on itself and asking, when do we not live up to our own standards? And you talked about so many of the founding fathers owning slaves. It took this nation a good, I mean, you could maybe even make the argument that this is a process that's still ongoing, but it took us a good, like probably 180 years since civil rights era in the 50s and 60s, when we realized that we do a lot of really hypocritical stuff. I mean, we have this document that we revere that says all men are created equal, and yet, I mean, the colloquials of men at the time, they meant people, but then you look at it and you say, yeah, but we don't treat everybody equally. We're being hypocritical. We're not even living up to our own standards. And that's where the concept of the moral principle is sort of diverges from the law. And that's where you can actually look at both of these and you can say, no, these are separate things. They overlap a lot of times. But what could be legal is a lot of times immoral. And a lot of times something that is perfectly legal to do is actually immoral. And and it was in the civil rights era, and even today, we find constant examples of this where we say, "Look, this might be legal, but it's certainly immoral to do this." And I think that is interesting. It took the United States that long to realize, hey, we're being quite hypocritical with some of this stuff, but we figured it out, and we're still figuring it out. And the country's still growing that way. So that's a good point.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, all right, I'd like to end this off with one question that I'm developing that I think I want to ask this of everybody because I think it's an important question. Um, who are some people? I guess like I feel like this often becomes a political thing, but just in general, going back to that topic of there's so much information out there. Like, who can you really trust? Like, I'm someone that believes in a pretty heavy amount of like corruption, and I have like I would say a healthy skepticism and distrust of institutions and people that seem to be the authorities and the people you're supposed to be listening to. Like I tend to doubt everything. So I always want to ask people who are some, and another piece of this is for the most part, especially in terms of politics and a lot of other topics, for most of us, the bulk of our opinions are based on like the media that we consume. We don't really have too much insight. We can see a little bit in our day-to-day lives, but we don't have too much insight into actually what's going on when it comes to running a government and international affairs and wars and all of these crazy stuff that we're just sitting in our homes and know nothing about. So who are some people out there that you think are trustworthy voices? And again, not necessarily on politics, but who are some people that you would recommend as someone watching this if they want to, they like the things that you're saying, they want to kind of travel down the direction of your mind a little bit more? Who are some people out there that you'd recommend to read or watch or look into?
Living or dead.
Sure.
So in the political area, I think. Oh gosh, this is such a huge question. Well, I guess so. I do agree with you as far as like people, especially politicians. Like whenever I read something for a politician or see a picture, the first thing I think when I see a politician in a picture is that was staged. That's like
Hmm.
that's what I think. And then when I read something that they have planned, my first question is, well, what's in it for them? How do they stand to gain out of this? And so I have that same sort of skepticism.
Yeah.
You do. Gosh. Uh, I don't actually watch. I don't actually keep up on a lot of politics. Well, I guess I do, but I don't take a lot of stock in it for that reason. I'm
Hmm.
much more interested in the political philosophy behind it and the ideas. And in that sense, I mean, a really popular, well-known book in the history of Western philosophy on politics is Plato's Republic. Uh,
Okay.
Plato was actually not a fan of democracy. In this book, he gives several arguments why democracy is actually a bad government, and talks about this idea that the rulers should be people trained in philosophy and whatnot. It's kind of
Hmm.
it could come across as a little bit high highbrow or kind of smug at times. I think actually Thomas Jefferson is a great person to read. Um,
I didn't even know he has books. Like he has a book you could read.
Oh yeah, he wrote
I don't
quite a
think I knew
bit.
that.
Another there's actually we talked a little bit about the Constitution. There's this other sort of corresponding set of documents that went along with it called the Federalist Papers, and I have not read those.
I've heard of it.
Yeah, kind of interested. James Madison
Hmm.
was like a chief author of that. In philosophy, political philosophy, another really great author is John Jacques Rousseau. He wrote a book in I think it was sometime in the 1700s, or maybe 1760, called The Social Contract, which is fairly easy to fairly low bar for entry. It's not too complicated. And in this
I've
book,
heard
he
of it.
describes um, why the government has legitimacy, like where it comes from and why it has the right to tell people what to do and to coerce them into doing things. And I think it's a really interesting book. And I think it's a good book from the perspective of what's my responsibility in society in terms what's my civic responsibility. Specifically, at answering the question of, like, let's say I vote on an issue. Is it my responsibility to vote in a way that helps everybody, or am I justified in voting in a way that just helps me, that just serves my,
Mm.
which is, I think, a really good question that everybody should think about. As far as like newer, more modern day books, there's two really, really popular books from the 20th century, from the 1900s. One of them, and they kind of went back and forth with each other, two political philosophers. One of them is called Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick. And in this book, he argues that the role of the government should be to interfere in people's lives as little as possible. Very kind of a libertarian viewpoint. And then there is another really popular book called A Theory of Justice by John Rawls. And he argues this really interesting idea called the veil of ignorance. And this idea is to say, here's the role of the government. Okay, the government should rule under the conditions of this thought experiment. And so here's this thought experiment. It's called the veil of ignorance. Imagine that before you're born, right, you're given a choice as to what the state of society, what the economic conditions of society will be like in terms of who gets paid what, how much do you get paid doing it, who has what job, who's capable of doing what job, in terms of, like, there's the busboy and then there's the CEO of the company. But here's the situation: you have no idea what position you're going to occupy in life. So you don't know if you're going to be a really intelligent person. You don't know if you're going to be, not so intelligent. You don't know how lucky you're going to be, what kind of family you're going to get born into. You don't know if you're going to be a man or a woman. You don't know what your race is going to be. You don't know anything. And so you have to ask yourself, well, in that situation, what would the most just society look like? Would the CEO of the corporation make 10 100 million a year, 50 million a year, while the busboy doesn't make enough money to even pay rent on a studio apartment? Or would things be a little more equal, would be a little more egalitarian? And yeah, I think that's another fascinating question. um, so that's political philosophy. We did touch a little bit on epistemology, this idea of knowledge. I think and that I think Descartes' Meditations is just a fantastic book, and it's so easy to read. Um, it's only about, I think, maybe 60 pages, and it's just really enjoyable. It was written in the 1600s. Descartes was one of the most intelligent human beings who's ever lived. He invented analytic geometry. Just a brilliant person, and he just wrote this book that he just asked himself, well, what's actually certain? What can we really know? And the one thing that he concluded, the one thing that we can really only know with 100% certainty, is that each of us, to ourselves, we know we exist. The one thing you know is that you can say, I exist. So he coined the phrase, I think, therefore I am.
Okay.
Yeah, just an
Interesting.
interesting idea there. Yep. And then I also think I would ask one more um, category that I would want to talk about a person is, who do I think serves as a great moral example
Hmm.
of, really, of how you should try to live your life. And earlier this year, in February, I read Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And it was the first time I've ever read it in my life. And I thought it was extraordinary. I think he's absolutely sort of a moral exemplar of people. If you had to be like somebody, you'd want to be like Martin Luther King, I think, Martin Luther King Jr. And then also, um, I would say, I would say from a standpoint of always seeking knowledge, of always trying to learn and always trying to understand other people's views, I would say Socrates. Yeah, reading the Platonic dialogues, Plato's dialogues, I think is just. I don't know if you always want to be as annoying as he was. He was called the gadfly. I mean, he would question people to the point of downright annoyance. But just this inquiring attitude, I think, is a is a virtue that is worth cultivating. Absolutely. What
Right.
that was a great question.
I'm sorry. I think you cut out for a sec. What was your? What
What
did you
would
say?
what books would you recommend? That was a great question.
Books that I recommend.
Or books are just speakers, people who are worth listening to or reading.
So I will just speak to some of the things that I've been reading recently that have had my interest a lot. I'll first start by saying the Bible. I'm reading it with a sort of an interesting perspective that maybe because I'm already thinking that there's a lot of subjects that we didn't get into today. So I'd love to do this again sometime. Religion definitely would be one of them. So I won't get too into that, but I will just say that I think, especially more like the New Testament, what I'm talking about, regardless of what you believe and if you think it's true and all of that stuff, if you're to read it and try to extrapolate the lessons that, if you can read it with the perspective of every single word that was put into this was put in for a reason, and it's setting some example for what we should be doing even 2,000 years later today. I think if you can, like, and you might think about it in different terms. You might not think about it in the sense of like God and Jesus and the way that it's described there, but I think a lot of people can kind of use their own terminology to still take the same meaning, even if you don't look at it exactly the same way. I think that if you can live by those principles, I think that that is probably the best recipe for a good life that I have read. And I will just to say one small thing, that I did not enter reading the Bible as, I'm a devout Christian and I'm just going to read this because it's the right thing to do. I read it with the perspective of, I'll say, a degree of doubt and asking questions. I think you watched like the other podcast that I have on that, and I definitely have plenty of, healthy skepticism and questions. But that said, I'm taking a lot. I'm not even done with it, but I'm taking a lot of value from reading it. Another book that I started reading recently is called How to Know a Person. And it's I think it's probably the best book. I'm barely even a quarter of the way through it, maybe. And it's one of the best books that I've read, or sources of knowledge that I've read on just how to approach interpersonal relationships. And just like how you should be treating people and how you should be looking at the conversations that you're having and the relationships in your life. So those are kind of two things that right now are particularly interesting to me. As far as like people that I listen to that I have a certain amount of trust for, I like listening to Joe Rogan. I certainly don't take everything that's on there with, for absolute fact, but I respect the show because I feel that it seems to me that he is doing what he's doing purely out of following curiosity. Who knows? Like I'm all for, like, maybe I'm completely tricked and everyone out there is not exactly what they seem, but I get the sense that he is pursuing his own curiosity, and so that there's a certain like integrity to it. Two other people that I'm liking in the last couple of years are Sean Ryan. I really like Tucker Carlson because of the fact that he left Fox News. I'm not like super into mainstream media. I have plenty of opinions on the agendas that are at play, and I think that kind of both sides, both the left-leaning sides and the right-leaning sides, both kind of are trying to accomplish the same things. So the fact that he had some sort of falling out, I don't know, if you know this story at all. I don't really know much of the story, but he was like one of the top guys at Fox and had some sort of falling out. My understanding is that it was something along the lines of like, they wanted him to portray things in a certain way that he may or may not have agreed with, and that led to him leaving the station and going independent. So that made me suddenly interested in him, and the things that I have listened to him, the episodes that I've listened to with him have been super interesting to me. So those are like the three podcasts that I listen to a lot. I'd say that's about it for me.
I would also add, talking about podcasts, he's not a political podcaster, but Sean Carroll is someone living
Okay.
I'm really interested in. He is a physicist. I don't know for sure what school he teaches at, but he's very well known physicist, very popular. He specializes in quantum physics, I think, and but he's also a trained philosopher, and so he's able to look at these issues in physics from a really sort of broad conceptual point of view. And he's just a fascinating, just extraordinarily intelligent person. He's written some really good books. Um, talking about you kind of brought up the Bible. Somebody who I've listened to in the past. Religion is something I used to be really interested in. And I used to watch. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this person, but I used to watch a ton of debates with William Lane Craig. Um,
Mm,
he's a popular Christian apologist, and he's spent, I mean, going on probably a good 30 years now, 30, maybe even longer, debating atheists. You can find hundreds of videos on him on YouTube. Just incredibly polished, great speaker. I don't always agree with his ideas. In fact, I would say I rarely agree with his ideas, but the man can debate. I mean, I respect his ability. He's such a good speaker. Um, yeah, very. I think he wins a lot of audience members just through his professionalism and speaking abilities alone.
oh, I'm sorry. What's his name again?
William Lane Craig
I
he is a research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. I think this
gotcha.
um, and he's getting up there now. I think he's in his 70s, so I'm sure.
75.
Yeah, he's slowed down quite a bit in his debate schedule the last, I don't know, like 5 or 10 years. But I mean, he's debated Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens.
That's a
Just
name I know.
he's debated Sean Carroll. Just so many people. Yeah, it's pretty
Interesting.
interesting. Yeah. He's really actually an interesting guy. He has I believe he has two PhDs. He has one in theology and one in philosophy. He could speak multiple languages. Yeah, he's just a really interesting guy.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. Maybe we could start off with religion the next time we do this because I
Mhm.
definitely like to. I have a few topics here that we didn't have time to cover. So, and I'm sure we probably could have spent the whole time here talking about like one thing that we talked about today. So there's always further depth to go into. But yeah, I appreciate you doing this with me, Drew. I had a lot of fun. I thought this was great.
Yeah, Richie, that was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun too.
Thanks a lot.
Yep, thank you.